Vienna, 1908. A city at the height of its cultural glory, where the cafes buzzed with intellectuals, composers, and artists, and where the cobblestone streets carried both the sounds of music and the whispers of unease. This was the era of Sigmund Freud, the man who had dared to look into the darkest corners of the human psyche and declared that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. But beneath the refined surface of this glittering capital, a far more macabre story was unfolding, one that blurred the line between medicine, folklore, and nightmare. It began, as so many strange tales do, inside the quiet, suffocating walls of a psychiatric ward. Among the countless case files tucked away in Viennese archives is a chilling account, an obscure report that would later be whispered about among doctors and patients alike. The report spoke of a man, ordinary in appearance yet unforgettable, who claimed something extraordinary, that he appeared in the dreams of others. Even more disturbing, this claim seemed to be supported by multiple unrelated testimonies. Individuals who had never met each other, from the locked cells of the Steinhof Psychiatric Hospital to the elegant homes of aristocrats, described seeing the same figure in their sleep. They sketched him, they wrote about him in journals, they confessed their fears to doctors. And the details matched with eerie consistency. Imagine for a moment being in their position. You dream of a stranger, a face you cannot place, and you wake unsettled. But then, days later, you hear another person describe that exact same face with uncanny precision. Suddenly, your private fear is no longer private. It belongs to the collective. The ordinary logic of dreams, where anything is possible and quickly forgotten, collapses into something more sinister. Dreams are meant to be intimate, unique, and fleeting. But what if someone else was inside them with you? What if he was inside everyone's? The early 20th century was a fertile ground for such terrors. Dreams fascinated the public, not only because of Freud's new theories, but also because of older superstitions that still clung to European consciousness. The night was a dangerous place, where spirits, demons, and omens were said to cross the threshold of the human mind. In such a climate, the story of the dream man spread like wildfire, first within the walls of the asylum, and then into the salons and coffeehouses where Vienna's intellectual elite debated the mysteries of the human condition. Some dismissed it as hysteria, a curious case of mass suggestion. Others insisted it was evidence of a hidden dimension of human connection, something that science had not yet dared to name. But the case would not be so easily contained. Reports began to multiply, coming from unexpected sources: students, merchants, even physicians themselves. Each account carried the same unnerving detail. The man's presence was neither fully threatening nor comforting. For some, he appeared as a guide, offering cryptic advice in times of stress. For others, he became a figure of terror, chasing them through endless corridors of dream landscapes. His face, while not grotesque, carried a strange quality that made it impossible to forget, even upon waking. He was not monstrous, but his very ordinariness became monstrous in itself, a face that seemed to slip past the defenses of memory and etch itself directly into the subconscious. This was more than a medical oddity. It was a haunting. And in the repressed, shadowed atmosphere of Vienna, the haunting gained a life of its own. Doctors argued over whether this was a psychiatric phenomenon, a social contagion of imagination, or something beyond comprehension. The public, meanwhile, began to whisper legends. Some believed the man was a lost soul, wandering from dream to dream in search of rest. Others feared he was a demon of the night, an incubus who fed not on flesh but on the vulnerability of sleep. Yet despite the strangeness, the documents remained factual, clinical, disturbingly real. Doctors wrote down testimonies. They drew the sketches. They tried to reason with patients who swore they saw him not only in sleep but on the waking streets of Vienna. The line between delusion and shared reality blurred until even the doctors themselves began to wonder, had they dreamed of him too? This story has never truly gone away. Variations of the man who appears in dreams resurface across cultures and decades, re-emerging most famously in the early 2000s with the viral phenomenon known as "this man." But long before the internet turned it into a modern myth, the first documented wave of this dream contagion was said to have begun here, in Vienna, more than a century ago. And it raises disturbing questions. Are we all carrying fragments of the same archetypal stranger within us? Is the human unconscious less private than we dare to believe? Or was there, in 1908, truly a man who managed to live in the dreams of others? In the chapters that follow, we will unravel the psychiatric files, the cultural context, and the chilling testimonies of those who swore they encountered him. We will trace the boundaries between science and superstition, sanity, and madness, and confront the unsettling possibility that dreams may not belong to us alone. The story of the Dream Man is not simply about a forgotten patient. It is about the fragility of the barrier between waking life and the realm of shadows. And once you hear it, you may find yourself wondering, as countless others once did, whether he might find his way into your dreams tonight. To understand why the story of the Dream Man shook Vienna so profoundly, we first need to step into the city itself in the year 1908. Vienna was not just a capital, it was the beating heart of European modernity, a city where beauty and intellect coexisted with repression and decay. By day, carriages clattered along the Ringstrasse, the grand boulevard lined with neoclassical buildings, cafes, and opera houses. By night, candlelit salons buzzed with conversations that would shape the future of art, science, and philosophy. Gustav Klimt was painting his golden visions, Arnold Schoenberg was rewriting the rules of music, and in quiet consulting rooms, Sigmund Freud was prying open the locked doors of the human mind. This was an age obsessed with dreams. For centuries, dreams had been the domain of mystics, priests, and fortune-tellers, interpreted as messages from the divine or omens of fate. But Freud, with the publication of the Interpretation of Dreams less than a decade earlier, had transformed them into objects of scientific inquiry. He argued that dreams were not random nonsense but carefully coded expressions of repressed desires and hidden fears. To Freud, the dream world was a theater where the unconscious mind staged its forbidden dramas. Vienna's citizens, from intellectuals to housewives, were suddenly encouraged to treat their dreams not as idle curiosities, but as windows into the very core of who they were. At the same time, Vienna was a city under immense pressure. Beneath the polished surface of culture, there was a climate of anxiety, repression, and moral strictness. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was crumbling under the weight of nationalism and political tension. Families were torn between old traditions and the temptations of modernity. Poverty and disease haunted the lower classes, while the upper classes hid their own neuroses behind closed doors. The psychiatric asylums of Vienna were overflowing with patients suffering from what doctors called hysteria, melancholia, and degeneracy, conditions that today might be diagnosed as trauma, depression, or schizophrenia. The Steinhof Psychiatric Hospital, perched on the outskirts of the city, symbolized this strange duality. It was both a monument of modern medicine and a grim warehouse of the forgotten. Its walls housed artists, writers, soldiers, and ordinary people whose dreams and fears had become too heavy to bear. Doctors there were fascinated by the unconscious, but they were also quick to label, restrain, and silence. It was in this contradictory environment, half laboratory, half prison, that the first whispers of the Dream Man began to surface. Vienna's obsession with the unseen was not limited to science. The city was also home to a thriving culture of spiritualism and the occult. Seances were popular among the bourgeoisie, who gathered to hear mediums summon the voices of the dead. Theosophical societies preached about hidden dimensions and astral planes. The line between respectable science and mystical speculation was thin. It was not unusual for a person to consult both a psychoanalyst and a fortune-teller in the same week. In this atmosphere, a story about a man who appeared in everyone's dreams could spread like wildfire, both as a psychiatric curiosity and as a supernatural omen. Vienna was also a city that lived in fear of contagion. Not just physical contagion, though diseases like tuberculosis and syphilis haunted the population, but contagion of the mind. Doctors worried about mass hysteria, a condition where fear or suggestion could spread through entire groups of people like a virus. Women fainting in theaters, religious visions erupting in convents, and sudden outbreaks of hysteria in factories were all documented phenomena. Against this backdrop, the idea that dreams themselves could be contagious, that a single man's image could leap from mind to mind, was both terrifying and plausible. It is also important to remember the role of authority and power in this era. Psychiatry was not simply about healing, it was also about control. To be labeled mad was to lose one's freedom. To claim that you had seen the same man in your dreams as countless others could easily be dismissed as delusion. But when doctors themselves began hearing reports from multiple patients, each independent yet eerily consistent, the story demanded attention. Some physicians saw it as a challenge to their authority, an affront to their belief that dreams were individual, personal, and rooted in repressed desire. Others, more open to the uncanny, quietly noted the testimonies with a mixture of fascination and unease. Vienna in 1908 was therefore the perfect breeding ground for the Dream Man. It was a city intoxicated with the mysteries of the unconscious, plagued by social anxieties, and captivated by the possibility of the supernatural. Every force, scientific, cultural, and spiritual, converged to make the appearance of such a phenomenon not only believable but inevitable. In no other city, at no other time, could this story have emerged with such force. And yet, even in this fertile environment, the figure of the dream man stood apart. He was not an abstract idea or a metaphor constructed in lectures. He was described as a person, a man with a face so distinct, so strangely ordinary, that it transcended categories. Doctors could not dismiss him as a mere archetype, because the patients describe him with the precision of someone recalling a neighbor. Spiritualists could not claim him as a benevolent guide, because others experienced him as a tormentor. He slipped through the nets of both science and superstition, becoming something darker, something that haunted the border between the real and the imagined. By 1908, Vienna was a city poised between brilliance and breakdown, a city that mirrored the fragile psyche of its people. And within this environment, the arrival of the dream man was not just strange, it was inevitable. He was a symptom of the time, a mirror of collective anxiety, and perhaps something more. As the case unfolded, it would reveal not only the limits of psychiatry but also the terrifying possibility that dreams were not private after all. The first whispers of the dream man did not begin in the lecture halls of Freud's circle or in the fashionable cafes of Vienna, but in a place far more hidden, the archives of a psychiatric institution. Among the thousands of case notes written in a cramped medical hand, there is one entry from 1908 that begins the trail. It was filed at the Steinhof Psychiatric Hospital, a vast, almost fortress-like complex on the city's outskirts. To the outside world, Steinhof was a symbol of progress, an asylum designed with airy courtyards and therapeutic pavilions. But for those confined within its walls, it was often a place of silence, shadows, and forgotten faces. The case file described a male patient admitted for what was then called obsessive delirium. The man was in his 30s, gaunt, with nervous energy and a tendency to speak rapidly about dreams. He told his physicians something that initially seemed like the ramblings of paranoia. He claimed that he could enter the dreams of others. More disturbingly, he insisted that people he had never met would later confirm his presence, recognizing him from their own nocturnal visions. At first, doctors dismissed this as delusion, a textbook case of what they called ego expansion, where patients imagine themselves as figures of supernatural importance. But then came the twist. Within days, other patients began reporting dreams featuring a man with strikingly similar characteristics. They were not in communication with one another, their wards kept separate, their interactions tightly monitored. Yet they described a face, narrow, with a pronounced brow, eyes that seemed both kind and menacing depending on the dream, lips that rarely smiled. Doctors, curious but cautious, began sketching from the patient's descriptions. When the drawings were compared, the similarities were undeniable. Here was not the vague archetype of a dream figure, but a clear resemblance repeated across individuals. The physicians attempted to rationalize it. Perhaps the patients had glimpsed each other in corridors or courtyards. Perhaps the man had a face so plain, so common, that it invited projection. But the records show that some of those who describe him had never been near the ward where he was housed. One aristocratic woman, admitted temporarily for what was termed melancholia, claimed she saw him in her dream the very night before she was admitted to Steinhof. She described him as standing silently at the foot of her bed, watching, before speaking in a voice she could not recall upon waking. When shown a sketch, she reportedly turned pale and whispered, "That is him." Soon, more testimonies followed. A law student suffering from nervous exhaustion drew almost the same face, insisting that this man had appeared in his dreams multiple times, warning him about his health. A middle-aged shopkeeper described being pursued by the man through a shifting labyrinth of streets, always waking just before capture. And then there were doctors themselves, though few admitted it openly. One junior physician, in a rare moment of candor recorded in the margins of a file, confessed to dreaming of a man matching the same description. He quickly added that it was likely the power of suggestion, the result of his exposure to the patient's stories. Still, the unease lingered. The case file grew thicker. Notes, sketches, testimonies, all describing the same figure. The staff debated whether to continue documenting it or to dismiss it as an embarrassing anomaly. Psychiatry, after all, was striving to establish itself as a serious science, not a collection of ghost stories. To admit that multiple people were dreaming of the same man threatened to undermine the field's credibility. Yet the evidence was too persistent to ignore. The doctors decided to keep the file, but they did so discreetly, avoiding public discussion. What made the dream man particularly unsettling was his ambiguity. He did not fit neatly into the categories of dream symbolism. For some patients, he was a guide, appearing at moments of crisis, offering cryptic advice, or simply standing as a silent presence that brought strange comfort. For others, he was a tormentor, a figure of dread who chased them or loomed silently until they awoke in terror. Unlike typical dream figures, who often shifted in form or blurred into abstraction, he remained stubbornly consistent. The clothes varied, sometimes a dark overcoat, sometimes indistinct, but the face was always the same. The physicians struggled with terminology. Was this a form of collective delusion? A contagion of the unconscious? Or was it merely coincidence amplified by suggestion? The patients themselves were not satisfied with such explanations. They insisted that the man was real, not in the waking world perhaps, but in some realm that touched them all when their eyes closed at night. One particularly disturbed patient wrote in her diary that the man told her she would never be rid of him, that he lived where the mind was weakest. She begged the doctors to find him, to stop him, as though he were a criminal hiding in plain sight. As word spread within the asylum, the man became a subject of whispered conversation. Patients began asking each other if they had seen him. Those who had not often did soon after, a development that baffled and disturbed the staff. Was this evidence of genuine contagion, a psychological virus passed from mind to mind, or simply the power of suggestion taking root in fragile minds? Even today, the line between the two is difficult to draw. One detail stands out in the file. When asked to describe his own role, the original patient, the one who first claimed the ability, was both evasive and calm. He told the doctors, "I do not choose to be in their dreams. They call me there." When pressed, he added, "I am part of them already. They just do not know it until they sleep." His words chilled the physicians, who recorded them but offered no commentary. Was he delusional, or was he articulating something far more unsettling about the shared nature of the unconscious? By the end of 1908, the file had become a quiet scandal within Steinhoff. Some doctors dismissed it outright as a curiosity born of mass suggestion. Others regarded it as a phenomenon worth studying, though dangerous to their reputation if made public. Either way, the dream man had entered the record. His face was drawn, his words were written, his presence preserved in the dry ink of medical notes. And once written, the story could not be erased. Patients continued to speak of him. Nurses whispered about their own strange dreams. Even after some of the original witnesses were discharged or passed away, the file remained, an unmarked folder among many, waiting for future generations to rediscover it. It was the first recorded trace of a mystery that would not die, a man who lived in everyone's dreams. The strange case of the dream man might have remained a contained curiosity within the walls of the Steinhoff Psychiatric Hospital had it not been for what came next. What began as a cluster of isolated testimonies soon grew into something larger, an epidemic of the imagination, spreading far beyond the boundaries of the asylum. By early 1909, the phenomenon was no longer confined to a handful of troubled patients. Reports of the same enigmatic figure began surfacing across Vienna, from students and merchants to members of the city's refined elite. The mechanism of this spread is difficult to pinpoint, but the medical notes give us clues. Some patients discharged from Steinhoff continued to speak of their dreams, telling family and acquaintances about the man who visited them in sleep. Servants whispered about it in kitchens, and rumors traveled along the invisible networks of gossip that bound the city together. In a society already obsessed with the hidden world of dreams, the idea of a shared dream figure was irresistible. Stories that might once have been dismissed as personal nightmares began to be told, retold, and compared. The unsettling conclusion grew unavoidable. More and more people were dreaming of the same man. Doctors attempted to document the scale of the phenomenon. Within months, multiple clinics and private practices in Vienna reported patients describing the same distinctive face. Some described it as narrow, with a prominent forehead and watchful eyes. Others emphasized his expression, calm but unreadable, as though he were concealing knowledge. A few noted that his features shifted subtly depending on the dream, yet there was always a core of familiarity. Like an actor playing different roles, he adapted to each dreamer's narrative, but the audience always recognized him. What disturbed the physicians most was not merely the consistency of these descriptions but the diversity of the dreamers. They were not confined to one class, gender, or condition. Students suffering from stress describe him. Wealthy matrons in therapy for anxiety describe him. Soldiers recovering from trauma describe him. Even children spoke of a man who appeared at night, sometimes as a guardian, sometimes as a pursuer. The phenomenon cut across the rigid boundaries of Viennese society, as if the man cared nothing for status or circumstance. Newspapers, always hungry for sensation, began to hint at the story in coded language. While few dared to print outright claims about a man haunting dreams, small columns appeared about unusual psychiatric cases and shared visions among patients. These fragments only fueled public speculation. In cafes, intellectuals debated whether it was an example of Jung's newly emerging idea of archetypes, universal figures embedded in the human psyche. Others argued it was proof of mass hysteria, like outbreaks of fainting or uncontrollable laughter documented in convents and schools. Yet beneath the surface, fear simmered. Ordinary citizens began to wonder if their own dreams were safe. What if the face they saw in sleep tonight was not their own invention, but the same face haunting their neighbor? Some claimed that just hearing about him was enough to bring him into their dreams, as though his image were contagious. A whispered name, a half-finished sketch, and suddenly he was there, standing at the edge of a dream. In this sense, the dream man became less a character and more a virus of the imagination, spreading silently from one mind to the next. The epidemic quality of this phenomenon fascinated and horrified physicians. One senior doctor wrote privately that he feared the man represented a new kind of psychological infection, something beyond syphilis of the brain or hereditary madness. He wondered if the unconscious mind itself could harbor contagions, passing ideas and images as easily as germs. His note suggested that if this were true, no one was safe, because everyone dreams. Not all accounts portrayed the dream man as menacing. Some saw him as a helper, appearing at moments of distress to offer cryptic guidance. A woman grieving the loss of a child claimed the man told her she must let go and move forward. A student on the verge of a nervous breakdown dreamed of the man calmly advising him to rest, as if prescribing treatment. Yet others described terrifying encounters, being stalked through dark alleys, suffocated under his gaze, or frozen in paralysis while he loomed over them. The ambiguity of his role only deepened the mystery. Was he savior, tormentor, or something else entirely? The spread of the story also had violent consequences. There are scattered reports of individuals accusing strangers on the street of being the man from their dreams. In one documented case, a young labourer attacked a passerby whom he swore was the figure haunting him at night. The victim, bewildered, had no connection to the man and barely resembled the sketches. Yet to the dreamer, the resemblance was undeniable. For him, the line between dream and reality had collapsed. Vienna's intellectual climate ensured that the phenomenon did not remain confined to whispered anecdotes. Psychoanalysts debated it in hushed tones, some intrigued, others dismissive. Freud himself, though fascinated by the mechanics of dreams, made no direct mention of the case in his published writings. Perhaps it was too unscientific, too close to folklore. Or perhaps even he was unsettled by the implications that the unconscious might not be an isolated landscape of individual repression, but a shared terrain where figures could wander from mind to mind. Meanwhile, in the streets and salons, the dream man took on a life of his own. Folklore merged with rumor. Some whispered that he was the ghost of a man who had died in the asylum, cursed to wander in sleep. Others believed he was a living person with uncanny powers, capable of projecting himself into the minds of others. Still others, influenced by occult societies, claimed he was an astral traveler, a soul untethered from the body. By the end of 1909, the phenomenon had reached a fever pitch. The dream man was no longer just a patient's delusion, it was a city-wide obsession. People looked for him not only in their sleep but in the crowds of the waking world. The epidemic had transcended the confines of psychiatry and entered the fabric of culture itself. Whether as nightmare, guide, or ghost, the dream man had become a part of Vienna's collective imagination. The epidemic eventually forced the medical community to confront an uncomfortable question. If so many unrelated individuals claimed to see the same man in their dreams, could it truly be dismissed as coincidence? Or was there something more profound at play, something that defied the boundaries of science and superstition alike? What had begun as a single entry in a dusty case file was now a phenomenon gripping an entire city. And as we shall see, the search to uncover who, or what, this dream man was would lead investigators into even darker territory, blurring the fragile line between psychiatric disorder, social contagion, and the possibility of the impossible. The epidemic of dreams had by now reached such proportions that doctors, journalists, and even ordinary citizens began asking an urgent question. If so many people were encountering the same mysterious figure in their sleep, then who was he in reality? Could he be traced to a living person walking the streets of Vienna? Or was he an invention of the mind with no anchor in the waking world? This question, seemingly simple, gave rise to countless theories, investigations, and rumors. The first avenue of inquiry was medical. Physicians at Steinhoff and other clinics tried to determine whether the man was based on an actual patient, a staff member, or perhaps even one of the doctors themselves. They compared sketches drawn by dreamers with photographs of asylum staff, hoping to find a match. The results were inconclusive. Some insisted the dream man bore a resemblance to a quiet orderly who had worked at the hospital for years, while others argued he looked nothing like him. A few patients pointed to portraits of strangers in newspapers, convinced they had found the face. Yet every lead dissolved under scrutiny. There were also attempts to classify the figure psychologically. Some doctors proposed that the dream man was not a real person but rather an archetype, a universal image of authority or mystery that appeared in the human psyche under stress. To them, he was the embodiment of the father figure, the judge, or even death itself, an idea rather than a man. Others, more skeptical, saw him as a case of suggestion. Once patients heard of the figure, they began to dream of him through imitation, much as a popular story spreads in folklore. But this explanation did not satisfy those who had dreamed of him before ever hearing his description. Outside the medical world, speculation ran wild. In the coffee houses where writers and artists gathered, theories bloomed like weeds. Some claimed he was a political agent, infiltrating minds to control them from within. Others whispered that he was a hypnotist, trained in the dark arts of suggestion, who could extend his influence even into dreams. Occultists, always eager for mysteries, argued he was a traveler in the astral plane, someone whose soul left his body at night to wander through the dreams of others. In such circles, the dream man was less a patient and more a magician. One of the strangest theories came from the emerging world of criminology. A police inspector, fascinated by the reports, wondered if the man could be a real criminal who had embedded himself into the fears of his victims. He collected testimonies from people who had been robbed, assaulted, or threatened, and found a few who claimed to have dreamed of the man before or after the event. Could he be a shadow of guilt or anticipation, a psychological echo of crime? The inspector even ordered searches through criminal archives, but again, no clear match emerged. There were also darker rumors. Some claimed that the dream man had once been a real patient at Steinhoff, a man who died under mysterious circumstances. According to this story, his restless spirit lingered, unable to find peace, and so he wandered into the dreams of the living. Others said he was a man executed decades earlier for terrible crimes, his punishment incomplete, his face imprinted on the unconscious of the city. Whether ghost, spirit, or curse, such explanations blurred the line between folklore and psychiatry, but in a city already steeped in superstition, they found willing ears. Ordinary people, meanwhile, struggled with their own interpretations. For some, the man became a scapegoat for anxieties that had no other outlet. When businesses failed, when marriages broke apart, when illness struck, dreamers pointed to him. He had visited their sleep, and misfortune followed. For others, he became a symbol of secret hope. The man's appearance in dreams was sometimes seen as a sign of protection, even of prophecy. One woman swore that he told her she would survive an illness that doctors had declared fatal, and indeed, she recovered. Stories like this transformed him into a kind of folk saint, a spectral guide as much as a menace. Despite the wide range of theories, no single explanation satisfied everyone. The very ambiguity of the dream man seemed to resist resolution. He could be villain or savior, ghost or projection, criminal or guardian. Like a mirror, he reflected the fears and desires of those who dreamed him. The more people sought to pin him down, the more elusive he became. Yet some researchers refused to give up. A group of young psychoanalysts, influenced by both Freud and Jung, began compiling records, sketches, and testimonies into a kind of secret archive. They believed that by gathering enough data, they might reveal the truth. In their files, they noted patterns. The man often appeared in transitional dreams, moments of change or crisis. He showed up at crossroads, train stations, doorways, and bridges, symbols of passage. He spoke little, but when he did, his words lingered in the memory of the dreamer like riddles. Above all, they recorded the uncanny consistency of his presence. Regardless of the dream setting, the man belonged, as if he were a native of the dream world itself. By 1910, The hunt for his identity had become a quiet obsession among certain circles in Vienna. Portraits circulated, each slightly different but always recognizable. Some artists even painted him deliberately, trying to capture the essence of the figure. These images, rather than settling the matter, only spread his presence further. People who had never dreamed of him claimed to begin seeing him after viewing the portraits. It was as though representation itself gave him power, allowing him to step into yet more minds. In the end, no consensus was reached. The dream man remained unanchored in the waking world, a riddle without solution. Yet perhaps that was the true secret of his power. He was not tied to one identity, one life, or one explanation. He was fluid, adaptable, a figure who lived precisely in the space between certainty and doubt. Whether he was a man, a ghost, or merely an idea, he had achieved something remarkable. He had entered both the dreams and the waking conversations of a city, and from there, the wider world. The more one asked who was he, the clearer it became that the answer was not one of flesh and blood. He was, in some strange way, everyone's and no one's. And perhaps that is why, more than a century later, his face still appears in dreams across the globe, an eternal stranger, waiting patiently at the edge of sleep. As the strange epidemic of dreams spread through Vienna and beyond, the need to explain it became irresistible. Human beings have always sought meaning in the unknown, especially when confronted with the uncanny. A single recurring face haunting the unconscious of thousands was too much to dismiss as coincidence. Theories poured in from every direction, scientific, philosophical, mystical, and conspiratorial, each attempting to cage the dream man within a framework of understanding. Yet every explanation seemed to fracture into more questions, leaving his mystery intact. The psychoanalysts of Vienna were, naturally, among the first to claim the phenomenon as their territory. Freud, though never publicly writing about the case, loomed in the background. His students and rivals speculated that the dream man was the embodiment of repressed desires, an archetypal father figure who appeared when patients grappled with authority or guilt. They argued that the face was not external at all, but conjured from the deepest layers of the unconscious. In this view, the epidemic was not a visitation but a revelation, proof that the unconscious was populated by universal images that surfaced under stress. To these analysts, the figure was not supernatural but psychological, a clue to how dreams stitched together memory, fear, and longing. Jung, at the time still shaping his breakaway theories, would later describe the idea of archetypes, collective figures imprinted into the human psyche across cultures. Supporters of Jung's ideas saw the dream man as a living archetype, proof that the collective unconscious was real. They compared him to mythological figures, Hermes guiding souls across thresholds, Hades lurking at the boundary of death, or even the trickster figures who destabilized human certainty. In this interpretation, the dream epidemic was not limited to Vienna. It was simply that the city's intellectual climate, rich with psychology and occult interest, gave the phenomenon the attention it required to be noticed. But if the psychoanalysts saw him as symbol, the medical establishment sought material causes. Neurologists proposed that mass hysteria was at play. According to this theory, once a few patients described the figure, suggestion did the rest. Minds are porous, and the unconscious can be seeded like a garden. The publication of sketches, rumors, and whispered conversations created fertile ground for others to dream the same dream. This explanation comforted some. After all, hysteria could be studied, charted, and eventually cured. Yet it faltered when confronted with testimony from those who had dreamed of the man long before they heard of his existence. These cases, though fewer, were difficult to ignore. Others suggested neurological coincidence, that the dream man's features were simply generic enough, bald head, thick eyebrows, neutral expression, that he resembled a mental average face, one that could plausibly emerge spontaneously in dreams across individuals. Researchers even attempted experiments, showing volunteers thousands of composite photographs of men's faces to test which features appeared most universal. The results did show a certain bland familiarity in the composite image. But here, too, the explanation seemed to fall short. The figure was not remembered as bland but as intensely specific, imbued with presence. He was not an anonymous everyman. He was him. Beyond medicine and psychology, other, stranger explanations emerged. Occultists and spiritualists insisted that the dream man was a genuine entity, a traveler between worlds. To them, the consistency of his appearance across so many dreamers proved he was more than an invention. Some declared he was a dream walker, a soul able to leave its body at night and wander through the minds of others. Others claimed he was not human at all but a manifestation of a spirit guide, a warning messenger sent to humanity. His appearances at thresholds, in times of illness or crisis, were read as signs of his role, to escort dreamers across boundaries they could not cross alone. These mystical theories found fertile ground in early 20th century Vienna, a city where seances and occult societies thrived in parallel to psychoanalytic salons. To believers, the dream man was a supernatural revelation. To skeptics, he was proof of the human tendency to dress confusion in mystical clothing. Yet both sides agreed on one thing: he was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, darker voices whispered of conspiracy. With the rise of new sciences, hypnosis, suggestion, propaganda, there were those who believed the dream man might be an experiment gone wrong. Perhaps, they speculated, a doctor at Steinhoff had been testing hypnotic techniques, implanting images in patients that spread further than intended. Others wondered if secret government programs were experimenting with mass control through dreams, the figure being the unintentional avatar of manipulation. These ideas, though fringed with paranoia, resonated with those who distrusted authority. In times of upheaval, conspiracy always finds believers. There were also more esoteric scientific theories. A few neurologists proposed that dreams might not be fully private at all. What if, under certain conditions, dreamers could share imagery, like radios tuned to the same frequency? The dream man, then, was a kind of psychic broadcast, an accidental signal picked up by many at once. The idea seemed absurd, yet it aligned with anecdotes of shared dreams reported throughout history. It suggested a collective landscape of the unconscious, one that could occasionally overlap between individuals. The dream man, in this sense, was not simply an image but a transmitter, proof that minds could leak into one another. In the public imagination, explanations became as important as the dreams themselves. Coffeehouse debates pitted scientists against mystics, journalists against psychoanalysts, believers against skeptics. Each theory revealed less about the dream man and more about the anxieties of the age. To the Freudians, he was proof of repression. To the Jungians, proof of archetypes. To occultists, proof of the spirit world. To conspiracy theorists, proof of control. And to ordinary citizens, he was whatever they most feared or hoped for. What made the phenomenon so enduring was precisely this openness. The dream man could be everything and nothing, his face an empty stage on which each interpreter cast their play. The uncertainty gave him power. Had there been one explanation, one final answer, his image might have faded into obscurity. But because every theory fractured into more possibilities, he lingered, feeding on doubt. By the time the epidemic began to decline, the theories had already embedded him into culture. Whether archetype, spirit, average face, or accident of suggestion, he had become more than a dream. He was a mystery, and mysteries endure because they refuse closure. Even today, when psychologists revisit the case, they find themselves torn between explanations. Was he truly a universal archetype, or a trick of contagious imagination? Was he a ghost, a projection, a man who once lived, or simply the reflection of ourselves? In the end, the dream man might have been nothing more, or nothing less, than what humanity needed him to be, a reminder that the boundaries between the known and the unknown, the waking world and the dream world, are far thinner than we like to believe. The dream man was not contained by the walls of psychiatric hospitals or the notebooks of psychoanalysts. Once his image began to circulate, he spilled into the bloodstream of Vienna's culture, and from there, into the imagination of Europe at large. By the winter of 1909, the figure was no longer a clinical curiosity. He had become a phenomenon discussed in cafes, whispered about in apartments, and even portrayed in art and satire. His presence was everywhere, both terrifying and strangely magnetic. Vienna at the turn of the century was a city alive with contradictions. Modern science blooming alongside old superstition, intellectual salons coexisting with crowded beer halls, spiritualists conducting seances in the same neighborhoods where doctors debated neurology. The dream man thrived in this environment. Newspapers, always hungry for sensational stories, published sketches and testimonies. Headlines spoke of a man in the dreams of Vienna, treating him half as a scientific puzzle and half as a ghost story. Cartoons in satirical magazines mocked the hysteria, depicting the dream man sneaking into bedrooms, whispering absurdities, or even running for political office. Yet the more he was parodied, the more familiar his face became, etched deeper into the collective mind. The public reaction was divided. For many, his appearance inspired genuine fear. Accounts describe people refusing to sleep, terrified they would encounter him. Some families hired priests or spiritualists to bless their homes, convinced the figure was demonic. In the poorer districts, whispers spread that he was an omen of death, appearing before accidents or illness. Families who lost loved ones swore the dream man had visited the deceased shortly before their final breath, cementing his reputation as a harbinger. At the same time, others embraced him with almost religious fascination. A small but devoted group began to treat the dream man as a prophetic figure. They recorded his appearances in dream journals, interpreting his gestures and cryptic words as messages. In cafes, it was not uncommon to overhear conversations in which dreamers compared notes, debating whether he had delivered warnings or promises. In this way, he became less a nightmare and more a guide, even a protector. One poet described him as the angel in the void, an unsettling but necessary presence during troubled times. The cultural sphere absorbed him quickly. Painters experimented with his image, capturing him in shadowed portraits that hung in galleries and private collections. Some works portrayed him realistically, while others exaggerated his features into grotesque masks. Writers, too, were fascinated. Short stories began to appear in literary magazines, spinning tales of men and women whose lives unraveled after meeting him in dreams. In the theatre, avant-garde plays incorporated his likeness, turning him into a symbol of modern alienation and dread. Audiences gasped when his face appeared suddenly in stage projections, an effect designed to mimic the uncanny intrusion of a dream. Even music was touched by the phenomenon. A few composers wrote experimental pieces inspired by the unsettling accounts. One such work, performed only once in a small salon, was said to mimic the disjointed, otherworldly quality of dreams. The dream man represented not in image but in sound. Those present described the performance as eerie, a composition that seemed to hover between lullaby and funeral dirge. But alongside fascination, there was mockery. The educated elite often dismissed the phenomenon as mass hysteria, a distraction from real social and political issues. Some intellectuals scorned the obsession, comparing it to medieval witch hunts or outbreaks of superstition. Yet their dismissals did little to dampen public interest. If anything, the attempts to ridicule the dream man only solidified his status as something dangerous, something establishment voices were too afraid to confront directly. The fascination with his image also sparked a wave of commercial exploitation. Merchants began selling cheap prints and postcards depicting the dream man, sometimes as a grotesque caricature, sometimes as a faithful reproduction of patient sketches. Fortune tellers offered services claiming they could interpret his visits. Street performers dressed as him, capitalizing on his notoriety. A few cynical entrepreneurs even manufactured protective charms, promising buyers that they would ward off the dream figure. For the price of a coin, one could buy safety from a nightmare. Whether they worked or not hardly mattered. The very existence of such trinkets showed how deeply he had penetrated the city's consciousness. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the cultural reaction was how quickly it transcended Vienna itself. Reports of the dream man began appearing in other cities, Berlin, Paris, even as far as London. Some claimed the image traveled along with the published sketches, the act of seeing his face sufficient to implant him in the dreamer's subconscious. Letters to newspapers described uncanny experiences, people thousands of miles apart dreaming the same expressionless man. The contagion of imagination had leapt borders, carried by rumor and print. This expansion sparked fear among authorities. If one man's image could spread so widely and deeply, what did it mean for social control? Could hysteria be weaponized? Could suggestion in dreams influence behavior in waking life? These questions lingered in the margins, troubling police inspectors and psychiatrists alike. But for the general public, the spread only added to the sense of awe. The dream man was no longer a Viennese curiosity. He had become a pan-European myth. Cultural reactions often reveal more about the people reacting than the subject itself. In Vienna's embrace of the dream man, one sees a society caught between modern rationality and ancient superstition, craving mystery even as it claimed to banish it. He was a canvas onto which every anxiety was projected: fear of illness, dread of political upheaval, suspicion of new sciences, and unease with the unconscious itself. His impact was not just in dreams but in art, conversation, commerce, and rumor. He had leapt from the personal into the collective, from the bedroom into the public square. By 1911, the fervor began to wane, yet his imprint remained. Though fewer new cases were reported, the memory of his cultural reign lingered. To this day, echoes can be found in archives of newspapers, forgotten paintings, and obscure poems. The dream man's cultural life was proof of how the strange and inexplicable can dominate a society, bending reality around it. He was more than a dream, he was a cultural storm. For decades, the mystery of the dream man seemed to hover on the edge of myth, a story half believed, half dismissed. Yet buried deep in the archives of psychiatric institutions, dusty boxes, and forgotten ledgers whisper of something far more unsettling, that the case was not just a matter of rumor and popular hysteria, but one carefully observed, recorded, and later concealed. The first hints of this come from the archives of the Steinhof Psychiatric Hospital in Vienna. Hidden among the standard patient records, treatment notes, diagnoses, and medical charts, are scattered references to a recurring nocturnal visitor described consistently across unrelated patients. One ledger from 1909 contains notations in a physician's cramped handwriting. Patient describes male figure appearing nightly. Balding, heavy eyebrows, fixed expression. Same description noted in 3 other cases this week. Such entries suggest that doctors were not only aware of the phenomenon but troubled by its regularity. The files show patterns. Patients across different wards, men and women, rich and poor, schizophrenic and neurotic, spoke of him with equal conviction. He appeared in dreams involving thresholds, doorways, corridors, railway stations. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were cryptic and unsettling, phrases like "it is time," or "you already know." Doctors noted that these encounters often provoked extreme reactions. Some patients woke screaming. Others fell into catatonic silence, convinced they had seen a messenger of death. Yet for all their fascination, the medical authorities seemed reluctant to publicize their findings. Reports circulated internally but were rarely submitted to medical journals. Why? Perhaps they feared ridicule from the broader scientific community. Perhaps the phenomenon undermined their authority. After all, how could psychiatry claim mastery of the mind if it could not explain why thousands of people dreamed the same man? Whatever the reason, the files suggest a deliberate quieting, an institutional decision to bury the case under routine bureaucracy. Even more disturbing are the fragments of correspondence between psychiatrists. Letters recovered from private estates show Vienna's doctors exchanging sketches of the dream man, comparing notes with colleagues in Berlin and Zurich. In one letter, a physician admits, "The figure is spreading, like contagion. We have patients who dreamed of him before hearing of the others. This troubles me more than I can express." Another warns, "Do not publish. To name him is to give him life." These statements hint at something more than scientific hesitation. They suggest fear, as if the doctors themselves felt implicated in a phenomenon they could not contain. Suppression was not limited to medical files. Police records also show traces of the case. In 1910, Vienna's police department received multiple reports from citizens claiming the dream man had visited them shortly before thefts, accidents, or illnesses. The police began informally collecting these reports, filing them under miscellaneous, psychological. Yet by 1912, references vanish. Later reviews of the archives show missing files, as though the records were deliberately removed. Whether destroyed or hidden, no one knows. Rumors suggest that some of these missing files were transferred to government ministries concerned with public order. The authorities, wary of mass hysteria, may have wanted to prevent panic. After all, if the dream man was seen as a supernatural omen or manipulative force, he could destabilize an already uneasy population. Austria-Hungary in 1910 was not a stable empire. Whispers of death and doom could feed unrest. By suppressing the case, officials may have hoped to silence the contagion. Ironically, their secrecy only fed the myth. Perhaps the most haunting detail comes from patient sketches preserved in a locked collection. Across dozens of drawings, the same face emerges: oval head, arched brows, a mouth neither smiling nor frowning. The consistency is eerie. Each sketch is slightly different, filtered through the dreamer's hand, yet unmistakably the same man. To look through them is to feel a creeping recognition, as though he might step from the page into one's own dreams. Modern researchers who have gained access to these sketches describe the experience as profoundly unsettling. Why, then, were these records hidden for so long? Some historians argue that the case was embarrassing for psychiatry, exposing the limits of early psychoanalysis. Others suggest a more sinister motive, that researchers recognized something too dangerous to acknowledge. If dreams could be contagious, if a face could leap from mind to mind, then the unconscious was not private at all. It was porous, collective, vulnerable to intrusion. For a discipline that sought to establish mastery over the psyche, this was unacceptable. Better to bury the evidence than admit that the mind was not sovereign. Suppression also preserved the figure's power. By hiding the files, the dream man remained in the shadows, neither fully explained nor dismissed. He became legend, his absence in the official record making him seem all the more mysterious. Every missing file, every redacted note, suggested a truth too dangerous to tell. Conspiracy theorists later seized on this silence, arguing that governments knew more than they admitted, that the dream man was perhaps a failed experiment in hypnosis, or even a psychic weapon. Whether such claims hold any truth is uncertain. What matters is that suppression created fertile ground for speculation, and speculation ensured his survival. The fragments that remain tell us just enough to unsettle, never enough to resolve. Medical charts describing identical dream visitors. Letters between doctors confessing their unease. Police files abruptly vanishing. Sketches locked away in private drawers. Each piece of evidence is a shard of a broken mirror, reflecting a figure who refuses to disappear. By the 1920s, official references to the dream man had all but vanished from institutional archives. The war had reshaped Europe, and psychiatry moved on to new concerns. Yet the files that do survive prove one thing beyond doubt: the case was real enough to document, real enough to fear, and real enough to suppress. Whether hidden by shame, fear, or caution, the records testify to a phenomenon that medicine could not explain, and perhaps dared not confront. The dream man had crossed from nightmare into history, and history, unsettled, tried to erase him. But erasure is not the same as forgetting. Like a dream that lingers after waking, the suppressed files remain, whispering of something too strange to ignore, too dangerous to reveal. The dream man of Vienna might have remained a curious footnote in psychiatric history, confined to the margins of dusty hospital ledgers, if not for one chilling fact: he was not alone. Across decades and continents, scattered records and testimonies reveal other cases, other dream figures, who share uncanny similarities to the man first reported in 1908. Though separated by time, geography, and culture, these apparitions suggest that the Viennese outbreak may have been part of something larger, a hidden pattern of shared dream visitations woven into human history. The earliest parallels predate the 20th century. Folklorists in rural Eastern Europe collected stories of a figure known as the visitor or the sleeper's guest. Peasants whispered of a bald, heavy-browed man who appeared in dreams just before sickness or death swept through a village. Unlike a demon or vampire, he did not attack directly. Rather, he was simply there, silent and observing. His presence was enough to chill the dreamer into waking terror. Some communities developed rituals to protect themselves, such as placing iron objects under pillows or reciting prayers before sleep. Though dismissed by scholars as superstition, these tales bear a striking resemblance to the Viennese accounts. Fast forward to the late 19th century. In Paris, asylum doctors reported patients describing a man of indeterminate age, balding, with an impassive face who visited their dreams. The details are buried in case notes of the Salpêtrière Hospital, where hysteria and hypnosis were studied under Jean-Martin Charcot. Most entries are brief, noted almost as curiosities. But one doctor, apparently unsettled, wrote in the margin, "This figure reappears too often to ignore. Patients do not know each other, yet describe him identically." The note was never followed up. In the early 20th century, around the same time as the Vienna outbreak, similar cases emerged in Berlin and Prague. Letters between physicians reference a dream contagion spreading in boarding schools and military barracks. In one case, a group of young recruits claimed they all saw the same man standing at the foot of their beds, speaking in a voice that told them to obey. The incident was hushed, dismissed as exhaustion and suggestion. Yet the testimonies, preserved in military archives, mirror the Viennese dream man too closely to dismiss. Outside Europe, the pattern surfaces again. In the 1950s, American psychiatrists began documenting patients who claimed to see a mysterious bald man in dreams. One of the most famous cases involved a housewife in New York who insisted the figure told her to take the children and leave. Days later, her apartment building caught fire. The story spread quietly among psychiatric circles, often retold as an example of dream premonition. Other cases in South America and Japan echoed the same details, the same face, the same enigmatic presence. The spread of mass media in the late 20th century only amplified the mystery. In the 1980s and 1990s, reports of the dream man began circulating on internet forums devoted to dreams and paranormal experiences. Users posted hand-drawn sketches of a bald man with thick brows and an unreadable smile. The images looked eerily similar to the Viennese sketches from 1909. Some dismissed it as coincidence, others as digital age folklore, but the fact that people continents apart, without access to historical records, described the same figure raised troubling questions. Patterns also appear in cross-cultural mythology. In Inuit traditions, dream spirits called Torngasik were said to appear in shared visions, often described as bald men with stern expressions. In parts of West Africa, oral histories speak of the Watcher in sleep, a figure who visits the dreams of those about to enter adulthood, guiding them, or sometimes terrifying them, into maturity. Though details differ, the resonance with the Viennese dream man is unmistakable, a face that recurs across cultures, serving as omen, guide, or threat. What connects these cases? Is it archetype, coincidence, or something more sinister? Some researchers argue that the dream man represents a universal projection of authority, the father, the judge, the faceless bureaucrat. Others see evidence of cultural transmission, one story sparking another, evolving as it moves through time. But skeptics face a harder problem when confronted with cases predating the Viennese outbreak. How did illiterate peasants in 18th century Poland describe the same figure as psychoanalytic patients in 1909 Vienna or office workers in 1990s New York? A few fringe researchers propose a radical explanation, that the dream man is not a cultural construct but an autonomous presence. In this view, he is not conjured by the unconscious but enters it, slipping from dreamer to dreamer like a parasite or wanderer. Such ideas border on the paranormal, yet they resonate disturbingly with the suppressed files from Vienna, where doctors admitted the figure seemed to spread independently of rumor. The strongest evidence for these connections lies in the uncanny consistency of the face itself. Across centuries and continents, from charcoal sketches in asylum records to crude online doodles, the same features return. The oval head, the dark brows, the fixed mouth. It is not the diversity of detail but the stubborn sameness that haunts. Dreams may be chaotic, shifting landscapes, but here was an image immune to distortion, as though it belonged not to the dream but to something outside it. By the early 21st century, modern compilations of these cases began to appear. Most famously under the phenomenon popularly called This Man websites collected hundreds of sketches and testimonies from around the globe, each eerily similar. Though skeptics insist it is an elaborate hoax or exercise in mass suggestion, those familiar with the suppressed Viennese records recognize something far older. The dream man had not vanished after 1911. He had merely adapted, resurfacing in new forms, new eras, and new technologies. What emerges from this web of connections is a chilling possibility. The Viennese outbreak was not an isolated event but one chapter in an ongoing saga, a recurring ripple in human experience. The dream man is not bound to one city or one decade. He is timeless, crossing borders and generations, a shadow wandering the corridors of the collective mind. And if these connections are real, then one unsettling question remains. How many more such cases have been buried, dismissed, or forgotten? How many times has he already appeared, only to be erased by silence? And how many times, still, will he return? By the spring of 1911, the strange epidemic that had unsettled Vienna's psychiatric wards and haunted its sleeping citizens began to wane. Reports of the dream man, once frequent and urgent, slowly diminished. Doctors who had once been alarmed by the apparent contagion of dreams now noted fewer cases in their logs, and newspapers that had briefly hinted at whispers of phantom visitations moved on to other headlines. Yet the decline was not sudden. It was more like the dimming of a lantern, fading into shadow until there was little left but memory and unease. At the heart of this decline was exhaustion. Patients who had once spoken vividly of the man in their dreams stopped mentioning him, as if he had simply lost interest. In some cases, the dreams themselves became more abstract, faces blurred, voices indistinct, and landscapes less defined. For others, the dream man lingered for a time, but weaker, like a fading echo. Instead of standing at the foot of the bed or speaking in cryptic sentences, he appeared in fragments, a face in a crowd, a shape glimpsed in the distance. By the end of the year, even those fragments were rare. The medical establishment, eager to restore a sense of control, interpreted the decline as evidence of suggestion and hysteria rather than anything supernatural. Doctors argued that the epidemic had burned itself out because it had no real substance, merely a shared illusion amplified by mass anxiety. Once the novelty faded, so too did the collective imagination. For administrators of the hospitals, this explanation was convenient, allowing them to close the matter without admitting how unsettled they had once been. But within private correspondence, the tone was less certain. Some psychiatrists noted that the decline felt unnatural, as though the phenomenon had withdrawn rather than simply evaporated. One physician at the Steinhoff Hospital wrote, "It is as if he has left, not as if he was forgotten. The patients speak of silence where once they saw a face, an absence more disturbing than a presence." Such reflections were never published, and instead slipped quietly into archives. Among the patients, reactions varied. Some were relieved, grateful to be free of the nightly visitor. Others felt abandoned, strangely bereft, as if something vital had been taken from them. One patient described it as like waking from a long companionship and finding the room empty. For a few, the absence produced greater anxiety than the presence ever had. They feared the silence was only temporary, that the dream man would return with greater force, waiting for the moment when vigilance faltered. Outside the asylums, rumors persisted longer. In the poorer districts of Vienna, where superstition clung to everyday life, families whispered that the dream man had been driven away by prayers or rituals. Some claimed he had moved on to other cities, warning relatives in Prague or Budapest to be on guard. Others believed his silence was more ominous, that he was not gone, but watching from somewhere beyond, preparing for another return. What remains striking is how quickly official memory buried the outbreak. By 1912, the matter was rarely mentioned in professional journals. The few articles that had tentatively raised the possibility of a shared dream figure were quietly dismissed or ignored. Doctors who had once been fascinated avoided the subject, perhaps wary of ridicule. The rise of psychoanalysis, with its focus on individual inner worlds, offered a convenient way to erase any notion of collective experience. The dream man, once spoken of with hushed alarm, was relegated to a curious footnote, a superstition of the mentally ill. Yet the decline itself raises unsettling questions. Why did the phenomenon end so abruptly? If it were merely suggestion, why did it persist so vividly for years and then vanish almost overnight? Skeptics argue that once the initial hysteria lost momentum, patients simply stopped feeding it. But those who study the suppressed files see a different pattern. The dream man appeared with great intensity, spread rapidly, and then withdrew deliberately, as if his work in Vienna was done. The disappearance also coincides eerily with broader historical currents. By 1911, Europe was shifting toward a decade of unprecedented upheaval. The continent stood on the brink of war, and collective anxiety was mounting. Some researchers speculate that the dream man's retreat was not an end, but a migration, that he left Vienna to manifest elsewhere, preparing to re-emerge during times of chaos and bloodshed. This would align with later reports in Berlin, New York, and beyond. In this view, the Viennese outbreak was not resolved. It was merely the first chapter in a longer, recurring story. For the city itself, the silence became part of Vienna's many buried ghosts. The psychiatric hospitals returned to their usual grim routines, dealing with madness, poverty, and despair in their wards. But somewhere in their locked cabinets, sketches of the dream man and notes on his appearances remained, waiting to be rediscovered decades later. The very act of erasure ensured the mystery deepened. The less people spoke of him, the more he transformed into myth. And perhaps that was his true power. To vanish without explanation is to leave a void that the mind cannot resist filling. The dream man of Vienna, in disappearing, became larger than he had ever been in presence. He passed from the immediacy of fear into the immortality of rumor, seeding himself into folklore, waiting for the moment when sleep once again grows restless and the collective mind is vulnerable. The silence of 1911 was not an ending, it was a pause. For when figures like this disappear, they do not die. They wait.